I grew up in New England, one of those tiny states all clustered together. So small, their names have to be printed off on the side of US maps. Honestly, this may be hometown pride, but I have to say, it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. There's just nothing like New England in the fall. The colors, the smell, the crisp air, and the change in the light. It's distinct, neither winter nor summer, a thing all of its own. In my town, more like a cluster of houses outside of an actual town. Autumn was both feared and celebrated. Every year, we'd set out the usual decorations, the wreaths, and pumpkins, and cornucopias. And then, we'd gather around the pond at dusk and wait. Every night, from first frost onward, waiting for the night that it would be cold enough for ice to form. We'd come out, dressed in our heavy winter gear, scarves, gloves, and hats, and watch for the lights. It was a sort of coming-of-age ritual for families that lived there. The little kids would be kept inside, watched over by an aging relative that couldn't participate anymore, until they were 8 or 9 years old enough to understand. Then, they'd be brought out to join the rest, handed a shovel or a scoop, and sip cider or hot chocolate, and eat apple cider donuts until their first shift was over. I'm sure it was deliberate that most of our first watchers were early in the night. The sun could set as early as 7, earlier in the winter, and it was almost never cold enough to freeze that early in the night, so most of us were hustled off to bed without incident. That was probably why I didn't witness my first freeze until I was almost 18. Winter came hard and fast that year, weeks earlier than expected. We'd barely assembled the first watch when the water began to freeze. My dad was the one to rouse me, giving me a good shake and tossing my snow boots on my chest. I got dressed in a hurry and followed him outside, excited for the gathering, which I still saw as an excuse to stay up and hang out with my cousins. It didn't hit me until later how worried he looked. Now, the lines etched on his face are echoed on my own. I smiled at my mom on my way out the door. Her voice followed me, urging me to be careful. I laughed, because what was there to be careful of? We'd be standing around watching the water for a few hours, drinking something hot and eating treats. My breath fogged the air, and I tossed my scarf a little tighter around my throat, awkwardly high-stepping my way through the snow and down to the pond. My dad was already there. I could see him with his back to me, standing there with a broad snow shovel, watching the water, when all of a sudden, he was lit up with a beautiful golden light. It was faint at first, noticeable, but not that bright, like a single candle in a dark room, lighting up only a few feet in any direction. It reminded me of Christmas lights, joyful, happy. Someone shouted. I heard something crack. It sounded like ice, and suddenly, everyone was shoveling or throwing snow onto the pond. I watched in shock, stumbling up to my father's side, just in time to see what looked like a woman smacking the underside of the ice. She was so pale. Her hair drifted around her in dozens of directions. The scarf around her throat was right up against the ice, which was so thin I could make out the individual threads beneath. "Don't look." My dad shoved me with his shoulder. It knocked me off balance and I stumbled to the side, but not before I saw the lady slap the ice with her mittened hands once again. and the ice lifted partially. Dad tossed a shovelful of snow onto her, while I gaped in horrified silence. I looked around, hoping someone else had seen and would, I don't know, intervene, stop him, make sense of the madness I was witnessing. It looked like my dad was murdering this poor woman. We should have been helping. She was drowning, but instead he was piling snow onto her head, knocking out the light. All around me, I saw people doing exactly what he was doing though. Even my cousins were on their knees shoveling snow with their hands, piling it onto the ice. And between the piles, I saw other people like the lady, all of them strangers, no one I recognized, until I did. A little boy, probably 10 or 12, with big dark eyes and a strange, old-fashioned shirt. I'd seen his picture on my neighbor's mantle every time I visited. His name was Eric. He drowned in the sea over 50 years ago, caught in a riptide while playing with his friends. He was her brother, older brother. She was 70 now, in the house at the end of the street, helping watch over the younger kids. He pressed his hands to a crack in the ice. I watched it buckle, and a thin, pale hand slid out bloated and brackish. Beneath him, I saw a perfect tiny village. Picturesque little houses laid out, dusted in perfect piles of snow. A pond in the center. Tiny people gathered around it. Against my will, I looked up. I couldn't seem to help myself. In the distance, beneath the clouds, I could see feet, legs, people, turning around, kicking and flailing. I looked back down and saw the arm of the boy, pushing through the ice. The village beneath him looked so sweet, so peaceful. All at once, I knew. I understood what they were doing. My dad, the neighbors, everyone around me. And I dropped to my knees, heaving as much snow as I could far out onto the ice. Over the boy in his grasping, clutching hand, I stole glances at the sky as I shoveled, mindlessly piling more and more, and watching the light up there grow dimmer and dimmer. I didn't stop until it was gone, until the light in the sky and the glow from under the ice were totally blotted away. When it finally was, I reared back, exhausted and trembling, and looked at my father. His face was tight. "It gets harder every year," I heard someone mutter behind me. Someone else agreed soberly. My dad took me by the arm and helped me to my feet. We walked home together in utter silence. I never again looked forward to the first freeze of the year. 16 years later, we pulled together enough money to have the pond filled in. We gathered together on the banks one last time and watched a backhoe shovel dirt into the water, the way we'd shoveled snow onto the ice every winter. A pump nearby continued to siphon the excess water away, pouring it into the river that led down to the lake. That was our mistake. We should have left the pond where it was. To the people who live around that lake, we're sorry. We heard about what happened after the fact. I promise, we didn't know it would carry like that.